I tried turning this ring to see if it would unscrew using those holes and tapping it, but that didn't seem to do anything. That ring is very thin. I stuck a screwdriver in here before and I was flexing it. You could see it flex, but I didn't want to pry up too hard on it because I figure it's not supposed to come out that way. It almost looks like, see, I can't tell if that's in a groove, if that's almost like a snap ring. If it is, it's not one I've ever seen. I mean, there's a slot right there, but that wouldn't close up enough to actually like compress this and snap it out. That's, I don't know. It's kind of got me flummoxed. I'm thinking it could be just another bearing pushed in from this side, but I don't know. Oh, so I was going to throw this in the shop press and try and press that out in the press, only to find out that this pulley's too wide to fit between the channels on my the lower support frame on the shop press. So I've rigged up this puller, and I actually put the old little bearing that I had taken out from that assembly there. It actually worked out to be a perfect size spacer to keep the center rod of the puller from going all the way down into the shaft. And I'm working at it, and I can see that it is actually pushing that shaft out. So there's going to be a bearing left behind inside this cup that I'm still going to have to figure out how to get out. But at least I'll be able to get this off of this assembly. Ah, success. And now that I have this off, I could see that shaft presses into, well, it's funny because that almost looks like a bushing, but that's actually, I can see the ball bearings in there. That is one sloppy bearing. Well, looks like maybe some of the balls are missing, but unfortunately I could see that definitely this bearing has to come out from this side. So this weird ring thing that I'm looking at here definitely is going to have to be removed. Well, I cleaned this up a little bit, and I mean, I've never seen anything like that. How cool is that? I don't know if you could see that or not. It's focusing, but there is a tiny set screw, a tiny screw in where that little gap is. And what I'm betting is that if I remove that screw, that's going to allow that gap to close just enough to loosen this ring, which I bet threads into this whole outer part right here. So in other words, back off for a second here. This ring right here, I think, unscrews from this assembly and allows the bearing to come out this way. But I think the reason why I was having trouble trying to unscrew it when I was tapping on it before is because of that set screw. So I'm going to take that screw out. Now that little tiny screw goes right into one of my little extra pill bottles that I don't throw out just for such an occasion, so I don't lose it. So now I'm going to try and tap on that ring by putting a punch in that hole and just tap it at an angle. I'm only going to give it a little bit of a tap each way. If I don't see it moving right away fairly easily, I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to wait until I can bring this over to a mechanic friend of mine to see if he's got any pliers, snap ring pliers, that are big enough to fit into those holes. Well, the good news is it turned pretty easily. Bad news is it just turns and turns and turns. I turned this thing probably about 180 degrees, and it is showing no signs of unscrewing, which indicates to me that this isn't threaded on the edges, that this is more than likely it's like some sort of a snap ring from hell, where you're supposed to have the right size snap ring pliers engaged in here that would squeeze it like this, closing this gap and reducing this diameter just enough to lift this out of here. I mean, that's the nearest I can figure. I'm also wondering whether or not it's not in its correct position to begin with. That maybe it should be further down, because that would explain the fact that this bearing that's in there now kind of really flops around. Of course, that also could be the fact. Yeah, that could be just the fact that this bearing is really trashed. Well, I'm going to quit there tonight. Hey everybody, it's the next morning. I had a chance to sleep on it, and as often sometimes happens, when I go to bed with a problem, I wake up with an answer. So what I decided rather than wait for pliers that might be able to fit in there and compress this, the more I thought about it, the more I thought that gap just seems way too small. I mean, even if I compress it so that gap completely closes, that would not narrow this diameter enough to expose, say, a lip that would probably be in a groove. In other words, if this part right here that's not down inside this bore, if it didn't have a lip that sits in a groove, it would be kind of pointless, because you should be able to just tap it out. So it's got to be in a groove. And if it's in a groove, then you need to be able to compress this more to get it out of that, to change that diameter down to get that part that protrudes out into the groove out. So that led me back to the conclusion that no, this must be threaded in, and I had only tapped it and maybe moved it maybe like a half a turn, and I didn't see any perceptible change. But this morning what I did is I got myself a couple of well, I don't know what this is. This is a really small tap from a reamer. Yeah, it's a really small reamer from my junk drawer. Anyways, basically just something I could use for a couple of pins to put in here, so then I could just stick a screwdriver in here and turn this a lot easier. And I gave it a full turn, and lo and behold, now it's coming up and I can see the first of the threads. It's really fine threads. This is threaded in. That also makes me think it wasn't threaded in far enough to begin with, because this bearing that's underneath there isn't being held from moving up and down in this position at all. I wouldn't be surprised at all if this thing was actually being turned by the fact that I think this bearing was so bad it may have even been seized at some point. But that's neither here nor there. The task at hand is going to be to unscrew this. Alright, so now this looks like what's left of this bearing in here is pressed into here. It's probably a light press fit, but I'll try and tap it out over here with a hammer, and then if that doesn't work, I'll just run it over to the press. Oh, check it out, I got a perfect little stand to hold this on while I tap. This bearing was supposed to be in pieces, separate pieces by design. Interesting. Alright, so I haven't cleaned this up yet, but I can already see that by design, that cup and that retaining ring that I unscrewed, and these three components right here, and all the ball bearings that fell out, they actually are a multi-piece bearing assembly. In other words, this was never designed to be as a self-contained bearing, ball bearing like in the conventional sense. So that means that all that sloppiness was due to the fact that that ring wasn't putting enough force on this. So what happens is the ball bearings ride in that groove, and then they ride in an outer groove that's created, they ride in this groove, and then they ride in an outer groove that's created by when these two halves are together. So tightening down that retaining ring is actually what puts your preload on this bearing. Now, either that ring loosened up over time, or the balls had worn out the groove to a point where there was excessive play in there, which was causing this to be able to move up and down way too much. So the question is, can I just clean all these parts up, find all the balls, put it all back together, lubricate it, and actually reuse it? Or do I see whether or not I can actually just replace these components? Or what I'm thinking is, can I just find a regular ball bearing, you know, regular enclosed ball bearing type that has the proper OD and ID to replace this? The other question is, why they do it this way? That's a good question. Why do this when on the very other end of the same shaft they use a conventional ball bearing? In other words, why not just use one of these on both ends? And you know what? That's a good question for my bearing supplier. I have a bearing supplier here in, well, not here in town, but 20 miles from me is Worcester, the major city, and there's a bearing supplier there that I think very highly of. I'll put their name up on the screen. Anyways, these guys are the bearing experts in my opinion. I like to go there and ask them these kind of questions, and then they can usually source a bearing for me if I don't find a new old stock substitute on Fleabay or one of those places.